I have watched this movie before, and it always begins the same way. The facts do not change, but the story suddenly does. One day, a foreign leader is formally described by the United States as illegitimate, criminal, and dangerous. The next day, when action is taken against that same individual, some of the very politicians who approved or tolerated that original assessment recoil, protest, and claim the response itself is unlawful or reckless. That is not a policy dispute. That is a narrative rupture. When intelligence assessments are treated as props rather than anchors, the entire strategic structure begins to fail. I spent years inside a system designed to produce continuity of judgment, continuity of threat assessment, continuity between what we say privately and what we defend publicly. When that continuity breaks, it is not accidental, it is chosen. The case of Venezuela exposes this dynamic with unusual clarity. For years, U.S. intelligence, law enforcement, and allied governments converged on a shared conclusion about Nicolas Maduro. Elections were deemed fraudulent. Judicial institutions were hollowed out. Senior regime figures were tied to transnational crime networks. U.S. courts issued indictments. Sanctions were imposed. Diplomatic recognition was withdrawn. These were not rhetorical flourishes delivered on cable television. They were formal acts of state power backed by classified reporting, interagency review, and international coordination. Once those determinations are made, they carry implications. You cannot label a regime criminal in one breath and then treat enforcement of that judgment as extremism in the next. What alarms me is not disagreement over tactics. That is normal in any serious policy environment. What alarms me is the speed with which previously accepted intelligence judgments are discarded the moment they become politically inconvenient. When politicians defend a man they once called a dictator, not because new intelligence has emerged, not because prior assessments were proven false, but because the political context has shifted, intelligence is no longer informing policy. Policy is retroactively rewriting intelligence. That inversion is fatal to credibility. Allies notice it immediately. Adversaries exploit it instinctively. Analysts inside the system learn the wrong lesson. Accuracy matters less than alignment. In intelligence work, consistency is not about stubbornness, it is about integrity. If the assessment was wrong, you correct it publicly and explain why. If it was right, you accept the consequences of acting on it. What you cannot do without corroding the entire structure is pretend the assessment never existed. When intelligence becomes a narrative accessory rather than a decision-making foundation, deterrence collapses. Enforcement becomes arbitrary, and the United States starts sounding like a country arguing with its own shadow. That is where strategic decline begins, not with a lost war, but with the refusal to stand by our own conclusions. Before anyone can pretend confusion about Nicolas Maduro, it is necessary to be honest about how he was officially defined by the United States and its partners over time. I am not talking about opinion columns or campaign rhetoric. I am talking about formal determinations made through intelligence reporting, law enforcement action, and diplomatic posture. Maduro was not casually labeled illegitimate. That conclusion emerged after repeated elections were judged neither free nor fair by international observers, after opposition parties were systematically neutralized, and after the regime consolidated control over courts, electoral bodies, and security services. Once those conditions are documented, legitimacy is not a matter of taste. It is an analytical judgment grounded in observable behavior. The United States did not act alone in reaching that conclusion. Dozens of governments publicly refused to recognize Maduro as Venezuela's lawful president. The European Union imposed sanctions. Regional organizations rejected the election outcomes. These moves followed years of reporting that showed the same pattern: electoral manipulation, repression of dissent, and the weaponization of state institutions against political rivals. From an intelligence perspective, this was a closed loop. The indicators aligned, the sources corroborated one another, and the conclusions were briefed repeatedly across administrations. There was no mystery here. What elevated Maduro from authoritarian strongman to strategic liability was the criminal dimension. U.S. federal courts indicted him and senior associates on drug trafficking and narco-terrorism charges. Those indictments did not appear out of thin air. They reflected years of intelligence collection on trafficking routes, coordination with non-state armed groups, and the use of state infrastructure to facilitate illicit flows. Once indictments are issued, the state is no longer making a moral judgment. It is asserting jurisdiction and alleging criminal conduct subject to prosecution. That line matters. You do not issue indictments as symbolic gestures. You issue them because you believe the evidence will stand. Sanctions followed not as punishment theater, but as enforcement tools. Oil transactions, shipping networks, and financial channels tied to the regime were targeted precisely because they were assessed as revenue streams sustaining both repression and criminal activity. Every one of these actions, non-recognition, indictment, sanctions, was justified publicly and defended internationally. No serious official claimed at the time that these measures violated international law. No one argued that Maduro was merely misunderstood. The position was clear. This was an illegitimate regime engaged in criminal conduct. That is why the sudden reversal in tone matters so much. When politicians now speak as if Maduro is a victim of overreach rather than the subject of long-standing legal and intelligence determinations, they are not expressing nuance. They are denying the historical record. Intelligence does not evaporate because it becomes uncomfortable. Either the original assessments were wrong, in which case they should be repudiated honestly, or they were correct, in which case defending the subject of those assessments is indefensible. You cannot occupy both positions without destroying the credibility of the system that produced them. I have seen intelligence get things wrong. That happens in any human enterprise. What is far more dangerous is when intelligence gets things right and is still discarded because it no longer serves a political narrative. That is what politicization actually looks like. And it rarely announces itself openly. It happens quietly through selective outrage, selective memory, and selective application of principles that were once presented as non-negotiable. The Maduro case illustrates this pathology perfectly. The intelligence judgments did not change. The facts on the ground did not reverse. What changed was who was acting on those judgments and how that action fit into domestic political alignments. When intelligence is healthy, it constrains policy. It sets boundaries on what can be plausibly argued. When intelligence is politicized, policy constrains intelligence instead. Analysts learn which conclusions are welcome and which ones create friction. Over time, that feedback loop reshapes behavior. Assessments are not falsified outright. They are softened, delayed, or buried. Public statements begin to drift away from internal conclusions. Eventually, politicians speak as though prior determinations never existed. That is not a failure of collection, it is a failure of institutional courage. What makes this especially corrosive is the pretense of legality. I have listened carefully when critics claim that actions taken against Maduro violate international or federal law. Those arguments collapse under even minimal scrutiny. The same legal framework cited today were accepted without protest when sanctions were imposed, when indictments were announced, and when recognition was withdrawn. Jurisdiction did not suddenly appear. It was asserted years ago. If those steps were lawful, then enforcement cannot be lawless now unless the entire legal foundation is being retroactively disavowed. No one making these objections has done that work. They simply invoke law as a rhetorical shield. This is where intelligence professionals begin to disengage. When assessments are treated as disposable talking points rather than binding conclusions, the incentive structure collapses. Accuracy no longer protects you. Consistency no longer matters. What matters is timing. That is how institutions rot without anyone admitting it. The system still produces reports, still holds briefings, still stamps documents as classified, but the connective tissue between analysis and decision-making is severed. Intelligence becomes theater. Adversaries are not confused by this. They understand it instantly. They watch US. Officials contradict themselves in public and conclude correctly that narrative cohesion has replaced strategic discipline. When a state cannot defend its own prior judgments, it cannot credibly enforce red lines, sanctions, or deterrent threats. Everything begins to look negotiable, reversible, and politically contingent. That perception is far more damaging than any single policy mistake. The real danger is not that some politicians defend a man they once condemned. The danger is that the intelligence system is forced to pretend that condemnation never happened. Once that line is crossed, analysis becomes fiction, and fiction is not something you can build strategy on. What replaces intelligence when it is pushed aside is not silence, it is loyalty. Loyalty to narrative, to faction, to audience. Narrative loyalty is seductive because it feels principled while avoiding accountability. It allows politicians to frame their position as resistance rather than contradiction. In the Maduro case, the shift is unmistakable. The same actions once praised as defending democracy are now condemned as reckless aggression, not because the target changed, but because the actor did. Strategic logic did not evolve. Narrative alignment did. From an intelligence perspective, this is a warning flare. Strategy requires coherence over time. It requires that assessments, once made, impose cost on inconsistency. Narrative loyalty dissolves those costs. It allows policymakers to disown yesterday's conclusions without explaining why they no longer apply. When asked to reconcile the contradiction, the response is not analysis, but emotion, outrage, moral language, appeals to abstract legality untethered from prior positions. That is how serious policy debate is replaced by performative signaling. I watched this pattern harden after years of counterterrorism work. Once an issue becomes a domestic identity marker, intelligence stops functioning as a constraint and starts functioning as ammunition. Facts are not weighed, they are selected. Maduro is either a dictator or a misunderstood leader, depending not on evidence, but on which storyline must be defended in the moment. That instability is not accidental, it is cultivated. It allows officials to avoid admitting that prior judgments require follow-through, which is often uncomfortable, risky, and politically costly. The strategic damage is immediate. Allies depend on predictability. When they see U.S. leaders reverse themselves without explanation, they hedge. Cooperation becomes transactional. Commitments lose weight. Adversaries, meanwhile, learn that persistence pays. If they wait long enough, narratives will fracture and enforcement will weaken. Sanctions become temporary inconveniences rather than enduring pressure. Deterrence erodes not through defeat, but through self-contradiction. There is also an internal cost. Analysts and operators learn that their work will be defended only when it aligns with the prevailing story. That knowledge changes behavior. Intelligence becomes cautious, sanitized, and reactive. Hard judgments are avoided because they create future liabilities. Over time, the system produces less clarity precisely when clarity is most needed. This is how states drift into strategic paralysis while insisting they are merely debating. Narrative loyalty feels righteous, but it is strategically corrosive. It turns intelligence into a prop and policy into improvisation. The United States did not lose credibility because others suddenly became hostile. It lost credibility because it stopped defending its own conclusions consistently. Once that happens, every action looks arbitrary, every enforcement looks selective, and every adversary senses opportunity. That is not ideology speaking. That is pattern recognition learned the hard way. When people hear the phrase intelligence failure, they instinctively think of bad data, missed signals, faulty sources, incorrect estimates. That does happen, but it is not what I am describing here. Some of the most damaging intelligence failures occur when the data is accurate, the assessments are sound, and the conclusions are clear, yet the system behaves as if none of that matters. In those cases, the failure is not analytical, it is institutional. The Maduro case is a textbook example of this quieter, more corrosive form of collapse. The information about Venezuela did not suddenly become unreliable. The indictments did not dissolve. The sanctions were not imposed on a whim. The assessment that the regime functioned as a criminalized state apparatus was not speculative. It was built over years of collection, corroboration, and interagency agreement. When politicians now argue as though enforcement itself is the problem, they are not correcting intelligence. They are pretending it never existed. That is a different category of failure altogether. In healthy systems, intelligence narrows the range of plausible debate. You can argue over timing, sequencing, risk tolerance, and end states, but you do not argue over whether the underlying assessment is real. Once leaders start doing that, intelligence becomes optional. It turns into a menu rather than a constraint. That shift teaches the wrong lesson to everyone downstream. Analysts learn that producing accurate assessments is less important than producing convenient ones. Operators learn that missions will be disowned if they become politically inconvenient. Over time, reality itself becomes negotiable. This is why I reject the claim that current contradictions reflect moral concern or legal caution. Those arguments would carry weight if they had been raised consistently when indictments were announced, when sanctions were tightened, when recognition was withdrawn. They were not. The objections appeared only when action created political discomfort. That is not law asserting itself. That is narrative self-protection masquerading as principle. The strategic consequence is cumulative. Each time intelligence is sidelined without being formally overturned, the credibility of future assessments weakens. Allies begin to ask whether U.S. conclusions mean anything beyond the current news cycle. Adversaries learn that pressure can be outlasted. They do not need to disprove the intelligence. They only need to wait for the narrative to fracture. Eventually, enforcement becomes episodic, and episodic enforcement invites defiance. The hardest lesson for intelligence professionals is this: truth does not fail on its own. It fails when institutions stop defending it. When accurate assessments are treated as disposable, intelligence becomes fiction, not because it is wrong, but because it is ignored. At that point, the system still looks intact on paper, but it has lost its governing function. Strategy without binding intelligence is just opinion backed by power, and power without credibility never holds for long. The damage caused by narrative inconsistency does not stay contained within domestic debate. It travels fast and it travels far. Foreign intelligence services, defense ministries, and political leadership study U.S. behavior with a discipline that often exceeds our own. They do not parse our intentions through press releases. They parse them through patterns. When they see senior U.S. politicians reverse themselves on a figure like Maduro without new evidence, without revised assessments, without formal repudiation of past conclusions, they draw a simple inference: American judgments are politically conditional. That perception has concrete effects. Sanctions regimes lose their coercive value when enforcement appears selective or reversible. States targeted by U.S. pressure begin to calculate that time is on their side. They invest in endurance rather than reform. They deepen ties with alternative partners who promise insulation from Western pressure. In Venezuela's case, those partners are obvious. Energy transactions, financial channels, and logistical networks reorient toward actors who view U.S. inconsistency as opportunity. When Washington cannot maintain a stable narrative about its own assessments, it creates space for others to rewrite the story entirely. Adversaries exploit this mercilessly. Russia, China, and Iran do not need to defend Maduro on the merits. They only need to point to American contradiction. They amplify U.S. dissent as evidence that sanctions are illegitimate, that indictments are politicized, that enforcement is arbitrary. This is not abstract propaganda. It is operational narrative warfare, grounded in our own statements. When U.S. officials argue publicly over whether a man they once called a dictator should be protected from action, adversaries do not see debate, they see fracture. Allies react differently, but the result is no less damaging. They hedge, Cooperation becomes narrower, slower, and more conditional. Intelligence sharing becomes cautious. Joint enforcement actions require longer negotiation. No one wants to be left exposed if Washington reverses course again. Credibility, once weakened, cannot be restored through reassurances. It is restored only through consistency over time, and consistency is exactly what narrative-driven policy cannot sustain. There is also a deterrence cost. Deterrence depends on belief that assessments lead to action and that action will be defended. When that chain breaks, deterrence degrades quietly. Targets test boundaries. Enforcement actions are probed for political weakness. Over time, the cost of action rises because every move is assumed to be temporary. The United States does not lose influence because it lacks power. It loses influence because others no longer trust that its power will be applied coherently. This is how strategic decline actually looks. It is not collapse in a single moment. It is erosion through contradiction. When intelligence judgments are publicly affirmed and then quietly disowned, adversaries gain confidence, allies lose patience, and the international system adapts accordingly. No press conference can undo that. Once inconsistency becomes visible, it becomes usable by everyone else. The hardest lesson intelligence professionals learn is that accuracy alone is not enough. Intelligence only matters if institutions are willing to stand by it when it becomes inconvenient. I spent my career believing that once an assessment cleared the thresholds of evidence, review, and consensus, it carried weight beyond politics. What I have watched instead is a system that treats intelligence as provisional truth, valid only until it collides with domestic narrative needs. When that happens, the analysis is not corrected. It is quietly abandoned. This is where the American strategic narrative truly collapses. Not because adversaries deceive us, but because we deceive ourselves about what we are doing. We tell analysts to speak truth to power, then punish the system when that truth demands consistency. We indict, sanction, and delegitimize a regime, then recoil when enforcement produces political friction. We pretend this is prudence or restraint, but it is neither. It is avoidance, and avoidance over time destroys credibility more thoroughly than any external defeat. From an intelligence standpoint, the lesson is unforgiving. Once assessments are subordinated to narrative warfare, future judgments lose their binding force, every conclusion becomes tentative, every warning is discounted as situational. That does not make policy more flexible, it makes it brittle. Decisions are delayed, half-executed, or reversed under pressure. Adversaries learn that they do not need to change behavior. They only need to survive the next news cycle. Allies learn that commitments come with an expiration date. The question in the title, Why Some U.S. Politicians Defend a Man They Once Called a Dictator, has a simple answer. They are not defending him. They are defending a narrative position that has become more important than analytical continuity. In doing so, they reveal something far more damaging than hypocrisy. They reveal that the system no longer treats intelligence conclusions as obligations, they are treated as options. That is the point at which intelligence becomes fiction, not because the facts are invented, but because the state behaves as if those facts impose no responsibility. When that happens, strategy dissolves into improvisation, enforcement becomes episodic, and credibility becomes a memory rather than a resource. No amount of messaging can repair that. Only disciplined alignment between assessment and action can. Until that alignment is restored, the United States will continue to speak loudly while meaning different things at different times. And the world, which is watching far more closely than we pretend, will continue to adjust accordingly.